Hello! It has been a while, hasn't it? I was working on a big video, and then I got burnt out. So in the meantime, here is a smaller video, so I don't die. I also edited this video in Final Cut and Motion instead of Vegas. So please let me know if the editing sucks balls. Thank you very much. Enjoy. There are a few games as famous as Galaga. One of those games where every video about it is bound to start with, Galaga. What else can be said about it that hasn't already been said? And I mean, really, what else can be said about it? It's one of the greatest arcade games of all time, with a dead simple gameplay loop that's easy to pick up and play, but hard to master. I'm trying not to delve into how it actually works and the rules of the game, because I'm sure you're already well familiar with all that, and if you're not, then go play it. Right now. It's a stone-cold classic, simple as, and it's been ported numerous times, from the MSX, Sharp X1 and PC-88, all the way to the PS4 and Nintendo Switch. Which is great news for everyone. An influential game that's aged like a fine wine is playable on just about anything you can plug into a screen. But there's also the fact that some of these versions, especially the earlier ones that had a hard time matching the sheer grunt of the arcade cabinet, have one or two things wrong with them, such that they just don't feel quite right, or how Galaga should. For me, this doesn't matter with most games, but it's a very different story with Galaga. The music, the sound effects, the color palette, even little things like the smoothness of enemy movement patterns and precise tone of background ambience can't just be close enough. They have to be either perfect or close to it. Nothing else cuts it for me. These days, that usually means Namco Museum Battle Collection on PSP or MAME on a PC, both of which emulate the original experience with grace and finesse. But it wasn't always like this. I've played many different versions, all with the express goal of finding the one that just hits the same spot that it's supposed to, and today we're going to find out why most of the ones I played didn't stack up in one way or another, or at least didn't stack up to my nitpicky ass. So, let's start with the first version of the game I ever played, the one made for the Jack-specific Ms. Pac-Man plug-and-play system, from the year of our Lord 2004. This was my first proper introduction to retro games as I know it, and what a magnificent little thing to start with. 5 Namco classics all playable in very accurate, faithful form. Ms. Pac-Man, Pole Position, Mappy and Xevious were all included, but the one that stuck with me the most was Galaga. There was just something hypnotic about its starry backdrop and buzzy, simplistic sound effects. And then when I pressed the start button and heard that iconic intro jingle, I knew from that day forward that this game was something special. I was some 4 to 5 years old at the time when I first played this, and despite it being so long ago, I can still vividly remember the first time I saw, heard, and played this game, and the impression it left on me. And I mean, from a modern perspective, it's not the best version of the game itself. It's got some niggles here and there, but it's all just close enough that I don't consider it a big issue. The intro jingle is tuned like 50 cents too high, and so are a lot of the sound effects. Some of the sounds don't have waveform modulation, etc. There's all sorts of little things like that which make it not quite perfect, and keep sound in your back pocket for the moment, because that's going to become a theme later on. Of course, I didn't know that as a kid, but honestly, I think it's actually one of the most pleasingly accurate versions of the game produced at the time, especially considering you got it inside a little controller that costed maybe $30 at the time. Aside from the Special Stage Perfect theme though, that thing needs to calm down. And perhaps I'm biased, because it was the first version of the game I played, serving as my gateway drug into Golden Age arcade games and retro games in general, but I can't help but love this version despite its flaws. But since it was owned by my brother, and I had to ask him if I wanted to play with any of his things, I didn't get to play it as much as I want to, and it didn't matter anyway because it wasn't long before the AV cable wires started to get flaky, and we threw it away before we moved, barely over a year later. I kept on thinking about it every so often for years afterwards, those sights and sounds still etched into my brain, even after several years of being busy with newer games on newer systems, particularly on N64, PS2, DS, Wii and Super Nintendo. Come 2012, I started to think about Galaga quite a lot. I roughly remembered the way it sounded, the way it looked, and the way it played, but my memories were getting fuzzy. Too fuzzy for comfort, quite frankly. So I set out to find a working copy. At this point, I hadn't quite figured out emulation just yet, so the way I played retro games was actually through some websites that let me play them in a browser. The first and last one I used was 1980-games.com. It was a simple little website that had a smattering of classics to pick from, and among them was Galaga. The website is actually still around today, so I decided to give this childhood version of mine another look and see if it's as good as I remember it. I ran it on both a Windows XP virtual machine on top of Arch Linux and natively on Windows 7 using Firefox 50 and Java 7 on both. And it's just okay. It's not a bad way to play Galaga, honestly. It emulates the original gameplay formula to a T. All the sounds and music are tuned correctly and the graphics are just about perfect. It's got a flaw similar to that of the Jack-specific unit, where pitch bends, like your shots and enemy death sounds, are done with glissando rather than portamento, so it sounds choppier than it should. Even if it did work absolutely flawlessly, there's better methods of playing this game anyway, especially when all of those let you actually full screen the game. Nevertheless, it still worked well for me for a little while, and though I loved playing the game whenever I got the chance, there was just one problem I had with it. It needed an internet connection to work. That doesn't sound like a problem today when just about anything and everything is on the internet, but being not the richest Aussie kid in the world, not so much. I was one of those people who didn't have reliably consistent access to the internet. The only thing I really had at the time were these little USB dongles that you could put SIM cards in, so you could use mobile data on a PC, which worked just about as well as you think it would. Thankfully, it wasn't long before this site would basically become obsolete for me, for it was in 2012 when one of my brother's friends introduced me to emulation. It started with a copy of Project 64, an Ocarina of Time that he gave us on a USB, and I was googling Mega Drive emulator and Super Nintendo emulator, etc. before you knew it. Not only did it open the doors to playing just about any game I could think of on these systems, but it was also more practical for me back then. Instead of having to wait for an opportunity to take my laptop somewhere or pray in vain for the stupid dodo stick to work just to play them for a bit, I could now download them to play whenever I wanted, and having the means to keep them also meant I could appreciate them in my own time, properly digest them over days, weeks or months, something I couldn't previously do. Plus it opened the gates for systems like the PS1, N64, etc. that couldn't be easily played over a web browser back then. So, having learnt about emulation circa mid-2012, I did quickly learn about MAME, and I found a ROM of the game somewhere without issue. But because this attempt was somewhere between 2012 or 2013, it was years before MAME had a GUI by default, so when I started the program just for it to throw an error message up at me, I gave up on it real quickly. I didn't know that MAME was command line only at the time, so I thought it was just refusing to work for absolutely no reason, nor was I aware of the concept of forking, so I didn't know that there were any versions of MAME with a GUI. So before I could get that working, I had to rely on whatever console version I could easily emulate at the time, and I played a whole bunch of them, all very close to each other. Specifically the NES, PS1, N64 GBA and DS versions. Just based off this list, a lot of you might think that I'm pretty set for Galaga. That's not a bad list of versions to have played, and I mean, I agree with you to an extent. All of these are fine ways to play Galaga, but not really to experience Galaga. And I mean, look, most of you are perfectly okay with these versions. They are basically 90% identical to the original in ways that matter to most people. But the problem with that is I'm not most people. Like I said, when I play Galaga, ideally, everything's perfect. And a lot of these have just a couple or even just one little niggle that makes me want to look over my shoulder, even if only for a little bit. So, you guys ready to get absolutely way into nitpicky details? I know I sure am. So, let's look at the Famicom version from 1985. This is one of the ports that came out when Galaga was just a few years old, and considering how early it is and the hardware it's on, it's another good way to play Galaga. In fact, it's probably the best version of the game until the PS1 version came out, so I'll cut this one some slack. This port is genuinely very good for what it is. But of course, we're here to nitpick, aren't we? So what's my silly little gripe with it? Well, for starters, the sound. The background ambience sounds more like a police siren than the ambience of space. But that's no big deal. You don't really hear it much, since it's basically always interrupted by the rest of the sound effects. But even then, the sound effects have a similar issue to that of the Jack-specific version, where there's no portamento in the game's sound effects, except here it's even worse, where slight little gaps in the audio before each note make the game's entire soundscape just really crackly and scratchy. I honestly don't mind the changes made to the timbre, I guess you could call it, of each sound. It's kind of charming to hear a different interpretation of these classic sounds. And I think this version largely succeeds, but this one oversight in the sound programming makes the game actually painful to play after a while, so I don't touch this one too much. It's a shame too, because if that one thing was fixed, it'd be one of my favourite versions of the game. I'll admit though, it's probably not as bad as I've made it out to be, so it might not bother you as much as it bothers me, so whatever. Next up is the PS1 version. Skipping ahead quite a bit because there were lots of versions between these two, but I haven't played any of them. We're just going over the ones I played as a kid, who was new to the emulation scene. And I'll be damned, this is a bloody excellent version of Galaga. It's smooth as butter, looks and sounds identical to the original, barring a lack of waveform modulation, as well as some tuning errors in the credit jingle, various sound effects in the ship capture jingle, which is an entire octave lower than it should be for some reason. At least it's not as bad as the version of Toy Pop that's on the same disc, where the game's entire soundtrack has been tuned down by a whole octave for absolutely no reason. This only has that problem in one little jingle. There's also the fact that the sound effects are a bit muffled, but ignoring the fact that it could have been due to storage limitations, it could arguably be a stylistic choice. Turning down the high end helps to give the sound a character akin to that of an actual arcade machine, where cheap speakers and the hollow cabinet could deaden the treble a tad, as opposed to the sharper, brighter sound of an emulator. But yeah, great conversion. A few issues, but still a bloody good showing. On the surface, the N64 version is much the same. It looks great and plays great, but for some reason, the intro jingle is like a key or two lower than it should be. Listen to this. It sounds like it's depressed, makes you want to just turn the game off and put it out of its misery. So does the score table theme as well, which is also used as a special stage perfect jingle for some reason. And then to add insult to injury, the captured jingle still has the same octave problem as it does on PS1. I can't compel myself to give it a high rating. Hearing those jingles are some of my favourite parts of the game, and to hear them butchered so badly hurts it quite a bit. Especially since it came out so much later than the PS1 version, and has not just the same, but more tuning issues. I'll give it one thing, a lot of the sound effects have been tuned correctly, closer to how they should be than the PS1 version, but not all of them are. Particularly, the tractor beam is still lower than it should be. Needless to say, good version to play, but boy, those sound issues really bloody bug me. The GBA version is a weird little one, funnily enough coming from the same company that did the N64 version, but 2 years later, in 2001. But I'd imagine they were done by different teams in the same company, because where the N64 version disappoints, the GBA version shines in comparison. It still manages to have a few issues the tuning from the PS1 version returns, but they're at least on par with it and not worse like the N64 version, so its representation of Galaga's soundscape is at least adequate. The bit crushing on the sounds is a bit much for me, especially when certain sounds play together and create a bit of clipping here and there. Some of the sprites look weird, but you can't really fault it for that, since the GBA's lower resolution of 240 by 160 instead of the arcade's 224 by 288 limits how accurately you can represent these sprites. It's not perfect, but it's still a great version considering what they had to work with, and sounds leagues better than the 50th anniversary version of the game on GBA, even though that version is emulation and not a port. Let's take a break from bitching about the sound for a moment and talk about one of my favourite versions. Armed with no cache GBA, the very first DS emulator I found and got working, I played Namco Museum DS from 2007 and found that the version of Galaga on here was bloody stellar for the system, genuinely. Plus, this Namco Museum has the best intro movie in the series, good shit M2. On the DS, Galaga runs perfect, looks perfect, and sounds perfect, with none of the tuning issues from prior versions. See that screen flicker by the way? This is not a glitch like I first thought. It's something that pops up in the DS version no matter what, since, like the GBA, the DS has a lower resolution screen than that of the arcade cabinet. So M2 implemented this pseudo-interlacing thing to create the illusion of extra detail, and this works really well on the DS's small screen. But on an emulator, even when the screen's big, or rather especially when the screen's big, it's a bit distracting. Especially because emulation can introduce stuttering and screen tearing that doesn't exist on real hardware, which only compounds the problem. But that's not the fault of the game, and on a DS's smaller screen, it's basically invisible due to the size and the fact that the game doesn't stutter or screen tear even a little bit. Plus, this version fixes a glitch with the original where apparently enemies would stop firing bullets, and they let you re-enable it if you want in a menu. How cool is that? This version is an absolutely flawless belter. So, out of all these versions, I hop between the PS1 and GBA versions the most, occasionally revisiting an old friend in the event I was desperate to hear that one jingle played perfectly. But I knew that all of these versions weren't quite scratching that itch for Galaga in the way I wanted. Despite it being such an old and simple game, it was impossible to find an accurate version that I can emulate with the hardware and knowledge that I had at the time. I could play Mega Man, Doom, and even Crash Bandicoot 2 in an accurate fashion, despite all of them being much newer, bigger, and more complicated games that you'd think would be harder to emulate, but they somehow just weren't. But all of that changed after I moved to a new town in the summer of 2013, where I started frequenting the local library. It was there where I discovered MAME UIFX through a tutorial I found on YouTube. It was MAME, but with a GUI, which made it a lot easier to configure and use. Even if it still wasn't an absolute breeze, it was certainly better than trying to wrangle the command line. And emulation is how I've continued to play the game ever since. Whether on PC or more recently the PSP, I can be safe in the knowledge that I have no shortage of options for playing one of the greatest games of all time. It's a bit embarrassing that it took Namco some 20 years until 2005 to finally get it right with the console version of Namco Museum 50th Anniversary, even if that should have happened 10 years earlier. But I will say, as much as some of these versions have flaws, there's something special about that. Even the worst flaws in the worst versions of this game are charming as hell. They almost give each of them their own sense of character. Whether or not that's a positive is up to you, of course, but personally, I love the slightly different interpretations of a game that ports like these can provide. Sure, they're a bit irksome when you just want to play a game, but as pieces of history, they're absolutely fascinating. It was one of the first games that got me interested in ports and the differences between them, along with Doom, for instance. Even if some were subpar, it kept Galaga and all the other Namco classics alive and breathing. Most of them are still excellent ways to play the game and experience the tension and excitement that comes from its core design. Does that mean I'd play these versions myself today? That's a tricky one. I can certainly tell you I'd avoid the N64 version like mad, but all the others aren't as cut and dry, especially since their flaws have to do with hardware limitations and or lack of experience in re-releasing older games, things I couldn't really help back then. But if I was in the same place as I was in 2012, where the best versions I had access to were the PS1 and DS versions, I can't lie, I'm not sure I'd still be happy with these versions in the conditions I played them as a kid. If I had an actual Namco Museum DS cartridge as a kid, then yeah, DS version all day. Easily the most well put together version I played at the time. But because I had to emulate it, the flickering was a lot more visible, and the way it stuttered made it even worse. But of course, that only makes me so appreciative of what we have today, where not just a few famous classics, but most everything from most every console, computer, handheld, arcade board, and phone can be emulated, from famous classics and hidden gems, all the way down to the worst games of all time. Emulation was like a Pandora's box for me, and learning it helped me get familiar with all the games from the past that I was missing out on. Games I didn't even know I wanted to play until I played them. It wasn't the first time I consciously chose to play an old game because it's old. I was like 4, I didn't know what a year was. But later on in life, it was the first I decided to seek out to play on my computer, and the one that taught me my favourite games can go anywhere, not just on the system they were designed for, or compilations that the publisher sporadically released on consoles. And thus, knowing that a massive back catalogue of games was at my fingertips, I started researching into which ones people thought were good, and trying some new games out all the time, properly exploring the pantheon of video games that later turned into a passion for documenting and talking about my findings to put together into videos like these that you're watching right now. That doesn't just speak to the power of a fantastic game, but having several different and varied versions of the same game, and how fascinating they can all be, weighing their strengths and weaknesses and appreciating them for what they were trying to accomplish on the systems that they were on. It all started because of my simple quest to play a simple game that I love to pieces. Thanks, Galaga. Yes, even you. Thank you for everything.